Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and what I've got in my hand is a sticker with today's date on it. And if you're a regular here, you probably know what that's all about. That means that sticker is going to go onto this tub, which right now, unlike all the other tubs that you see back there on the shelf, does not have a sticker on it yet, but pretty soon it's going to have a sticker attached to it. But not until we first take care of one thing, and that one thing is the migration of worms out of my oldest tub over here. It's the worms that have been collecting over on this side of the container, over here in the little shade section of the bin where the plastic is helping keep things nice and damp. Over here I've been trying to allow time for the finished castings to air out, become a little bit more dry. And today, after 12 days of this migration action going on, this will be the first haul out of worms to get them relocated out of this tub and situated in their new home. So let's get this up on the bench and get to work. So now to help me get the worms over here into their new home, I've got a couple trays. We'll scoop everything out into here. And then I've got the this little tray that we can collect a bunch of stuff that we can return into composting service when we rebuild the feeding zone in here. But we're going to be extracting pretty much everything, so it's going to fill this thing up pretty much, and then we'll go ahead and we'll pick out all the large chunks that we know can just go right back into resetting this feeding zone. And then hopefully what we'll be moving over is almost worms only. The aim of having all this material here covered with only that piece of paper was to allow for a good amount of moisture to just leave the bin, at least over there. The idea of having the plastic here was to not allow that moisture to turn into vapor and evaporate away, but rather stay down here in the area of the feeding zone. It's all in an attempt to make that feeding zone as alluring to the worms as possible, to try to get them to come on over. It's a lot of stuff. I wonder how it's going to fit in here. Just barely, I'm assuming. But right away, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start pulling a lot of large chunks out of this that can still be used once again just to continue luring any worms out of the material over here. I guess the easiest thing is to stick to the original plan, which was to simply scoop out everything that makes up the feeding area. But I have to guess that I'm going to find stuff like whole banana peels and other large chunks of paper, like these pieces of coffee filter we could see up on top of the surface. A lot of this stuff can go right back in when we rebuild the feeding area. And some of it will simply go with the worms into their new home so that they've got a cozy spot somewhere in the new location where they can feel comfortable for a little while, because it's a fairly fresh bin. Usually I like to let the bin sort of sit for a while and let all the contents of it sort of start preliminarily breaking down to make it really comfortable for the worms. But since I only built my new bin that I'm putting these little guys into yesterday, it just hasn't had a chance to really prime the way I like my new bins to prime. But that's okay, we'll do fine. This was my last handful, I think, because I'm almost completely out of space here. I really don't know how I'm gonna scoop. Maybe we can go for one more. I'm gonna have to really carefully scoop some of the materials that I pulled out over here, which can probably stay to help us reconstruct this feeding area. But you know what I'm gonna do? I'm going to work right down in here by bringing this piece of plastic back. And we'll rest this mound of stuff over here on the plastic. So we got stuff like this, you know, that it's going to do really well in the feeding area if we just return it into the feeding area. And that's definitely food. But then there's other stuff like this, which is bedding. So I'm going to try to be real gentle here, not have a huge avalanche of stuff flying all over the place, but it seemed to me like it should be pretty easy to grab a certain amount of this out of here without Wow. Without it being too complicated, I guess the only thing was I didn't expect to have so little working area here to do this. I feel like I want to kind of push and nudge and run my fingers through this thing and just pull out any large chunks that I know are in here. But if I do that, I'm going to knock everything over. Maybe I need to just get myself into a slightly larger container to do this in. At least maybe a secondary holding spot that I can keep them in temporarily so I can sift through a reasonable amount. Because this tray should work fine for doing this. It's just I've overloaded it. So I think if we reduce it to maybe half, that we can sift through. We'll begin with a somewhat more reasonable amount. Alright. Well, at this point you can see I've got a pretty good sizable amount over here. And I've run my finger through this pile in this tray here a number of times, and you know, I still managed to pull up pretty minute particles, which I think are fine to just go with the little guys into their new home. Obviously, if I find something a little bit larger and I can knock the worms off of it, let's grab that and keep it too. But I think some of this bedding that's in here is fine if it just stays with them. Alright, gotten things in this pile pretty much down to almost worms only. So if you go down low and give the pile a flip, you can see it's almost all worms in here, and obviously castings breaking away from in between them as they squirm. But we've definitely got a good amount of material that we can, you know, reuse to rebuild the feeding area. Not to mention this little divider that we can replace to help keep this process kind of neat and clean to a certain point. It is always sort of nice to be able to, you know, just have a well-defined space that you consider to be your feeding area. And I like the divider. If nothing else, is, you know, at least just a visual cue for me to see where the food and everything was versus where the old castings were. But, you know, as long as we've got all this space in here, I'm wondering, nah, let's not do that quite yet. I don't want to take up time when I still need to go through this stuff here. So right away, I'm already seeing a good number of large chunks of material. I guess if I could pile it up here briefly and they don't like the light, then they'll go into this pile of worms rather than staying with the material. I'll just be able to scoop this material out here and add it to our collection at the end. But if I could just run my fingers through this material a few times too and pull out all these large chunks of paper or whatever I can find, then we'll be set to rebuild this feeding area. I just need to pull a few things out of the freezer. I don't know how much we'll need. It's probably good if I go pretty hardy, because we are pretty much pulling out almost everything that's edible in here. I mean, there were a few bits and pieces of things that were, you know, carrots maybe from the last reinforcement feeding, which was 4 days ago. Obviously the banana peels from the original feeding, but almost everything else is gone. The only thing I'm finding are these chunks of paper that we used as bedding. And I think we might need to break out a couple more pieces of newspaper to help us have enough bedding to rebuild over here, because my bedding supply is a little bit tapped out from having built this bin yesterday. When I built this new bin, I pretty much used everything that I had laying around, all kinds of cardboard and paper. And no, I'm exaggerating. I should have no problem finding something that would be usable here. But I mean, you know, if you look through this stuff at this point, most of it just breaks away. If there's any good sized chunk of whatever, if it looks like food or bedding or whatever, I can still snatch it out of here, but it doesn't seem like we're going to come up with much. So I think we've got ourselves our landing party. Let's remove all the reclaimed stuff and drop in all the worms. guess here too, giving me a little better view of what other sort of stuff are at the bottom of this container. I guess once the worms squirm away, we might be able to pick out a couple more little chunks of bedding that we could recycle. But otherwise, I would say we've got ourselves a good number of worms in this pile here. Sometimes I do my best to try to just give these little guys a little bit of time and skim off the material that they've squirmed down out of already. Try to reduce it just to a, collection of worms only, practically, if I can, but I'm not going to worry so much about doing that today. We'll have an opportunity to see them all when I release them into their new space. And then we'll be able to just maybe visually try to estimate how many we've moved over. It's always these little itsy bitsy baby worms that are such a pain to get off my container. They're up on the container wall, but you could barely get a grip on the little guys. The larger size ones all fall off pretty readily, but these little guys, they don't fall off at all. Now we've got them all. Oops, one more. So now to get the job done, something I like to use is the perforated cardboard just as a little bit of a divider. And here's some stuff that I bought down from the freezer. It's just a whole bunch of different types of vegetable peels basically, and some other odds and ends. All frozen right now, but it'll thaw out quickly. And I'm looking at what we collected in terms of recycled bedding materials. It's taking up more than half of this container. I could probably strip up a few pieces of cardboard or paper or something else, whatever, a couple things just to get this thing sort of rebuilt. But before we do that, why don't we move the worms aside? I'm interested in seeing how things look out here within the material. Sometimes it seems to me like I should do this earlier in the process to see what the story is, because if if I go in here, I look around, I see that there's no more worms in here, that would mean that the migration has effectively ended, which means, now why did I bring down all of this stuff? Although right now I'm not thinking that that's going to be the case, so I'm not anticipating that, not at all, not after 14 days. I have sort of just unofficial notes, one of them indicating that one of my recent migrations of the worms like this out of finished compost did finish in 18 days, which, if we're at 12 days now, we're only about a week away from that. So if that's a record of sorts, to me it seems almost attainable in terms of breaking that record. We did everything we could. We tried to allow time for this material out here to dry a little bit. We let them work it down pretty thoroughly without giving them any fresh feedings for a while. They've had lots of opportunities to really turn the stuff in this container to a really fine batch of vermicompost. So I'm just starting to peel away back here, all the way at the far end, away from where the feedings were occurring. There's a couple worms here and there. It's funny how they're just congregating in the corner. Maybe there's just something about that which is luring them over there. Maybe there was just a morsel of delicious food remaining in there. I guess now is a great time, I suppose, to break up any chunks of anything in the bin that remains, just to make it all really easy for the worms to be able to travel through this stuff. Break down any remaining bits and pieces, but maybe more importantly to find a way over into the new feeding area. So we've definitely found a few worms here on the very far edge, and that usually means that it's going to take a little bit of time for the worms to finally get moving, to get mobile, to want to move out of this fairly nice material. It still feels kind of damp and I imagine cozy enough. And it's obviously littered with little bits of bedding and paper and food scraps, I'm sure. So there's all kinds of stuff in here that, we could have given more time to. We could have allowed this previous process, which is what I call foraging, the time that I give the worms to work their way through the material pretty thoroughly. We could have allowed extra time for foraging, but what the heck. We figured let's give it a try. The material looked pretty far along. The worms are pretty happy and mobile and healthy. So it did seem like if we laid out a nice, tempting place for them to run to, they might come in great numbers. I think they have come in great numbers, but there's also great numbers of them remaining, clearly. So let's take all this stuff we scraped off the top. It looks to me like stuff that can easily go back into the feeding area to get a little bit more moisture than it would get if it stayed out here, and maybe a little bit more attention than if it stayed out here. Because the whole idea of what remains out here is stuff that I want to make, you know, less and less appealing for the worms to remain in. Give it a chance to air out, become more dry, a little bit less comfortable for the worms to stay in. They'll realize pretty quickly that there's other areas in the bin that are more comfortable, specifically our feeding area. All right, I think we've done a really nice job over here, kind of tilling up all the material, loosening it all up, making sure there's no big hard clumps that would make it hard for the worms to get in and out of or through. But I think it's time to rebuild the feeding area. It definitely seems to me like, you know, keeping the chunks of bedding material fairly large makes it a lot easier to handle it later if you want to pick through it and extract worms or separate worms from it. If the pieces of bedding you use are left pretty large, then I think there is a benefit to it. So let's see if we can do just that. Let's keep some of these bedding bits that we just created pretty large. All right. The material looks so fine and it all crumbles very nicely. It's still a little bit damp, but not too much because it's not sticking to my glove all that much. A little bit here and there. I've broken up all the chunks to the best of my ability that I could. And we've got a lot of this unbroken down material that was surfaced earlier. Get it over into play into the feeding area. So we're almost at the finish line here. There's only one thing remaining for us to take care of, and that's releasing the worms into their new space. So let's get to work on that. Oh wow. I always forget how light a new bin is. I was about to put a lot of effort into pushing it over here, and then it just slides almost, without any effort. Because it's so light. I just built it yesterday. It's got hardly anything in it. It might look like a lot when we first open it, but it's mainly just a bunch of stuff that's fluffed up on top of itself. I'm sure it'll all start collapsing pretty quickly once the worms start working the material in here down. I wasn't quite sure of the amount of moisture that I had placed in here to counteract all the dryness of all the dry materials that I used in this bin to build it. So I was hoping that I've arrived at a pretty good dampness level. And it feels pretty good. So I'm not going to worry about it right now. I'm not going to fret. I think what we can do though is we can dampen this piece of paper at the end when we cover back up and put everything away. So let's get to it. I guess what I can do is try to preserve a little bit of this leafy stuff that's out here on the top so we can cover them up at the end. Create a little landing pad for them. Should be pretty cozy. There's all kinds of goodies in here for them. And let's welcome them to their new home. All right, 2 stragglers. And that's it. Not bad. Is that another one? Here's our only chance to see how many we managed to enlist in this little project. So let's see. They're in there. Let's see if we can spread them out a little bit so they're not piled on top of each other. I like to give all of them kind of an equal shot at being able to squirm down out of the bright light as quickly as they can. Now let's give them a little bit of peace for a few minutes and I'll start cleaning things up around here. I was watching and waiting for when that little guy finally squirms down under the surface, because I believe that was the last worm that I saw that was still mobile on the surface. So so that's it. Get these little guys covered up a little bit. We can keep these top covering items a little bit cleaner. I like the idea of dousing this in water again like I did yesterday. Because then right on top of it will be the plastic. It'll force all the moisture that's sort of soaked into it now or pulled up on top of it now to work its way down into the material that's beneath it. The material felt like it was in pretty good shape. I think we're okay from a dampness perspective. I didn't know what to expect. Yesterday it seemed like we may not have used enough water in here, but hopefully we did. Actually, I think we did. I think we're fine. All right. So that's it for today. I'm covering it back up, and as you may have noticed, I sort of complemented the piece of plastic that fits up nicely against 2 of the 4 edges, but since these other 2 edges out here are not covered up, I thought I'd try to expand the range of the plastic coverings a little bit better, just to make sure that whatever moisture is in here right now stays in here until such a time that we can confirm that it's okay to stand on its own. I always worry about bins at this real kind of young, tender age that they can shed their moisture a little bit too quickly and dry out very easily. So it's times like this I try to keep it all sort of under wraps and make sure that it does hold on to the moisture that the worms need. All right, everyone, it's official now. It's always at this point, but not prior, that we always add the official sticker and welcome the bin to the worm community. All right, everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye now.